Exactly what is in COBRA and what are its objectives?
Well, I think it was mentioned yesterday about the creation of COBRA, but it started back in 1989, as an instrument, really, through which we can network and form a coalition of all the various groups that are involved in reparations, with the basic thrust toward getting other groups that never had thought about reparations involved. We found there were many individuals who had for years been working reparations in various parts of the country. Various organizations which had reparations or repatriation or a place of our own as part of their general understanding. And we felt it was important to coalesce these groups together so we can form a solid front in terms of moving toward reparations, because reparations is, though the thought of money comes to people's minds first, it's so much more than money.
Okay.
But when you're speaking to I think it's one of the things that Malcolm X taught us, that you have to speak to a man in his own language. The language of America is money. And so when you speak about money, you automatically get their attention. Now, what you do with that attention is the most important thing that COBRA is about. It's about educating the people about the truth, about what happened in this country, about the distortions of history that have taken place in this country that have put Africans, not only Africans, but all folks of non-European stock, at jeopardy in this country, and about self-determination, about the fact that everybody has the right, the human right, of being able to decide for themselves where they want to go, as a unit or as an individual.
I see.
And we have always been denied that right.
Okay. Now, you touched on precedent. Has there been precedent regarding reparations?
Oh yes.
Okay.
I think when you look at the historical frame of reference, going far back as a ship that landed here, and after the Africans had taken over the ship, had commanded the ship, and were misguided and landed here, because they sued for return to Africa. Now that's a form of reparations in a sense, so we can almost go that far back. But just going back, say, 100 years now, 104 years, we had one of the largest groups ever formed in this country around reparations. You hardly even hear about it. But they were dealt with in the as a matter of fact, we often look at them as the forerunners of what happened to Garvey, because the government did the same thing to them as they did to Garvey later on. Okay? They convicted them of mail fraud, of all kinds of things, and actually took them apart in that manner.
Okay.
But that was back in 1864. And here we are again. Like everything else in the world, things are cyclic. Everything has its own cycle. And it looks like reparations, or the push for reparations, has almost a 100-year cycle. But each cycle, as the spirals go, moves you a little bit closer to fruition.
It just expands.
That's right.
I see. How long do you think that it's going to take to make reparations a reality? Understanding that outwardly growing spiral.
Everyone sort of looks at the Japanese as a model. Okay. I tend not to, because I understood that for 40 years this country had resisted signing the Genocide Convention, and they were being forced in position to do so. And so the Japanese reparations came up as a good way of covering up a crime that was going on at least until 1978 in terms of enslavement of the people, right here in Alaska, in the Pribilof Islands. Okay? So part 2 of that Japanese bill, which they don't even talk about, gave restitution to the natives of the Pribilof Islands, and almost 3 times as much money as the Japanese portion got. They don't mention that. So we sort of look upon the time frame as being at which time this country will feel too embarrassed not to give us reparations.
I see.
It's not a matter of good conscience, it's not a matter of change of faith, because we're talking about an act which would really change the nature of this country's relationship to the world. And I think that's part of the problem why we have such a horrendous, aside from the emotional impact it takes, has a horrendous thrust against reparations and keeping it down.
I see. Okay. There are those who suggest that people of African descent are not deserving of reparations, since purportedly some Africans aided in the capture and enslavement of other Africans. How do you respond to that? How extensive was the role of Africans in the enslavement of other Africans?
As extensive as the role of the Quislings in France, who betrayed the Frenchmen. And I think that it's something they pick on, but that happens in almost any place where you have oppression taking place. You're going to find some people, we have them even now, who will rather do the master's bidding, or whoever's winning, be on that side than be on what they might see as a losing side.
Right.
And we had Quislings too. We had folks who made a good deal of money, I would imagine, on raiding other villages.
Tippu being an example.
And bringing. But then the problem with that, though, is that though slavery existed to some extent in Africa and around the world, even prior to our being enslaved, slaves were never treated in the manner they've been treated here in this country, in the West. Okay? Those folks who enslaved others, who captured folks for the slave trade, never even thought or could have possibly conceived that they would be selling their brothers into this kind of inhumane treatment. Slaves were known throughout the history of Africa to move from enslavement up to almost Pharaoh's heights. It's in the Bible.
It's a different type of slavery.
Different type of slavery.
What would you call the type of slavery that we had endured? Is there
genocide?
Genocide, okay. Unlike other forms of slavery in the past, our slavery is rather unique. Would you say that that's a valid statement?
I'd say it has taken slavery to the farthest extreme that mankind can imagine.
How would reparations be dispersed?
Well, I don't think either you or I or any small group we could get together has a right to determine that for a mass of people. I think what has to happen is that not only Africans in this country, but this country has to be educated to the point of understanding the truth and the injury done. And then we've got to understand who we are as a people. You can't expect someone to be reclaimed or have their injuries redressed if they don't know what was injured or who they are. So a good portion of that has to do with finding the system or the method through which Africans in this country can vote, intelligently vote, as to what form and what amount reparation would be necessary to repair the injury done to us.
What criteria would you suggest be used to develop monetary redress? It's a hard question.
It is a hard question.
Yes.
Because it deals with such a small portion of what reparations is about.
Right.
I don't think any amount of money could properly compensate for the injury done.
Right.
And so any monetary regress would be based upon the assumed losses, that our people have suffered as time transpired. So you'd be making assumptions, where would we be had we not been denied the economic opportunities that have been denied us?
Yes.
Or what would we need at that point, since that becomes an insurmountable amount? What would it take to put us on equal basis with those who have profited off our enslavement? Now that might be a better way to look at it, than to say, because this country, nor this world can afford. Because I say this world because reparations is no longer simply a national issue. Almost every member of the diaspora will be suing Europe for reparations.
I see. Assuming that we get reparations, how do you think we should handle the money? How do you think it should be dispersed? Should we consider a global or a bank, or just pass out checks, or what? A lot of people have that question. They're very confused about that. When you say reparations, they tend to think paycheck. What would be your response to that?
I guess it would have to take a variety of forms. The most important form we have to take would be building those institutions that allow us to re-educate ourselves in an African-centered type of way as to who we are and what we're about. And with that going on, you can probably put additional funds into those agencies and organizations which have allowed us to survive this Holocaust and who have been, deprived of the kind of funding necessary just to keep us surviving, okay? And then I think we've got to talk about those institutions and organizations being constructed even now that would help in our economic and political development, right? And not lastly, but not leastly, because we are in dire shape, there has to be some compensation to individuals. But we don't see that as being the forefront. We do understand that that's the thing that hits people quickest and what people are more concerned about, especially as suffering people. But that same thing that causes suffering people to want some cash right now to assist them, okay, is the same thing that keeps the rest of America, who sees this as being a loss to them, as having an emotional reaction.
Are there any efforts in the area of United Nations or international court?
Yeah, not for the first time either. This is nothing new. I think Queen Mother Moore petitioned back in '68. Malcolm went through the OAU in petitioning for redress for our human rights. And so, as you go into the international field, you're talking about human rights more so than how does a particular country compensate those people living within it. Okay? Presently, Salis Mohammed has a petition in the UN on it. Okay? Only 2 years ago, the OAU had an international conference on reparations, in which many of in fact, I think Ron Walters mentioned, he went in behalf of us, as the head of the American delegation. So it's an international piece at this point, right? And it'll be dealt with in that same fashion, because each group of Africans, wherever they find themselves now, have particular needs that may be different than elsewhere. For instance, right now Africa is suffering from the international debt. And part of what they're claiming is that they want that not just reduced, they want it eliminated. Now that may be good for Africa. That will not help us as much as our needs are at this point right here.
Do you think that H.R. 40 has a chance in making it through the House subcommittee?
Well, we're gonna know some of that soon. This year, '94, almost everyone comes up for re-election. If we can get enough momentum between now and November election day to have that issue placed in front of every candidate running, we can at least get the public awareness of it going. Okay. If not, the bill is still in subcommittee. Okay. We're not going to lessen at any rate our desire to have hearings by that committee on the bill. We're prepared for them. We've been prepared for 2 years for hearings. We've got a list of folks ready and able and capable, and folks whose reputation cannot be disputed, to be the first group to come to a hearing. So as soon as, it's almost like you say, when we're going to get reparations. As soon as we can change either the climate of this country, or this country realizes that one way it can keep its international face, they'll have hearings. If we go the course we're attempting to go, through educating people first, we won't be using our money in the same manner anyone who's received reparations before has used it. We'll be using reparations developing a real world order. Let me put it that way, okay? Not an order based on a Western concept of exploitation, which is all much of what's happened in this country has been. And so we're talking about creating a different kind of a system, and this is what frightens them so. Yes. Because we're talking about using money, using capital, using communication in a totally different way, in a humane way, okay? Not in an exploitive way, not in an imperialistic way, not in a forceful way. Okay? And so, we've had a recent example. The IRS made a mistake, and they accepted 1040s that were amended and requesting reparations on the coast. That this happened just recently, and some folks got up to $40,000, in IRS money. One 26-year-old boy went out and bought him a BMW. A sister called me from California saying, I hope this is not what happens with reparations money. That we just take it and go right back into the system with it. Okay? And so that's why education is so important. That's why knowing yourself is so important. When they chiseled that message on the temples of Africa. You know, man, know thyself. It was for good reason. And we've got to get to the point where we again know ourselves. This is why we're in no rush for it. This is why when we formed in COBRA, we set in for a long battle, okay? The longer the battle, the more folks get educated. The more folks get educated, the wiser will be the use of reparations. And the wiser the use of reparations, the more the world will benefit. Because the world has been denied the genius of black folks for a long time, unless it was covered up, you know, and used by some corporate structure or named under someone else's name. And I find that even folks who are against reparations, when they sit down and talk, give them a half an hour, and you start talking about what can happen as a result of reparations. Even the folks who feel fearful say, you know, we'd be better off with this. You know, if you're thinking about it in the proper light, if you're thinking about simply about making more black capitalists, more black corporations, more black soldiers to go abroad and extract resources, and either human or mineral resources from other people, you're not thinking about reparations, not for Africans.
What effect does your involvement in the reparations movement have on your career as a professional?
I find it's an extension. I consider myself a functional artist. Okay? But as an artist, though, I also realize I've got to have the proper environment to really create my art. And I find that racism has made much of what I would consider art ineffective. Okay, because in my way, it's not art for art's sake. All the art that they've uncovered around the world have, for the most part, been beautified artifacts, utensils that were made more creative and more useful by the relationship of the spiritual embodiment into him. Okay, and so I found myself in social work very early in life, you know? And so this is no more than that. This is just a continuation of what happens to a social worker when you realize that one's humanity is being denied them, either through being impoverished or being misinformed or being whatever it might be. Social work is about helping them transcend that.
Do you think that Americans feel affirmative action and EEO legislation has been an unofficial form of reparations?
Yeah, I think they'd love to feel that. They love to believe that. It's part of the whole denial that exists in this country. Though, like every other social reform that's taking place in this country, we've sort of spearheaded it for Americans because we have been the ones who suffered most by it, you know. And in that spearheading, you know, we've managed to get enough of the public involved in it to have it become a reality for most people. We have benefited so little from most of those things. Okay? We find that as is the war on poverty, anything they give you, they take away. We're finding this now. You know, all the civil rights, 25 years of civil rights, so to speak, on the books, is being eaten away at this point. You know? I think they'd love to believe that, but let's look at it this way. America is not only suffering from racism, it's suffering from exploitation of the poor.
Right.
Okay? And the poor have been left in the cities. We had our convention in Detroit just last month in July. And I remember Detroit in the 50s. I remember a booming metropolis. I remember, you know, after the war, the cars were rolling and folks were making money and feeling good about themselves. They moved the industry to Mexico.
Yes.
Now that's just not about black folks. That's about disrespecting of all Americans. This country needs a Marshall Plan. You know, we need reparations. Now we will benefit both by the Marshall Plan this country needs and by the reparations that will make us who we are as a people again. So I can't see them with any validity feeling that this is just compensation for enslavement, something which benefits all people, something which should have been part of America's
infrastructure
thrust in the first place. You know?
Right.
The corporate structure has lost its patriotism. They're now international corporate structures. They're now they don't even call them international now. They call them pan-nationalist corporations. They don't care about Americans. And I think, to use the expression that I don't like, many whites are suffering because they now feel they're being treated like niggers.